Hey there. When I first started making YouTube videos, I was already a published writer of role-playing game material, and at the time, 9 years or 8 years or so ago, I was really into crafting my own miniatures and tabletop role-playing game terrain, using cheap, often recycled materials inspired by the innovative crafting techniques of the craft father, Scotty McFarland of the DM's Craft YouTube channel. Scotty crafted dungeon tiles from cardboard, added another strip of cardboard to represent low walls without obscuring the view of the terrain from players sitting around the table, painting the tiles to emulate stone, wood, and so on. I was not a fan of buying lots of paint and found it tended to warp my tiles anyway, so I tried printing existing map images and pasting those cut-out bits of paper to the cardboard instead. This proved to be quite popular and inspired many others to do the same when I promoted a new modular dungeon tile set designed by Joe and Sarah Bilton of Heroic Maps, based on my suggestions and the modular set created by Gareth Barrett of the DM Info channel and website. 9 years ago was a real hotbed of activity in the crafting scene. About a year ago, the crafting products of Crooked Staff Publishing came to my attention, and I picked up all sorts of products including a full RPG and campaign resources quite recently, all of the terrain files I would need, and when it came to checkout, I looked at the price, then I did a double check at the price of just one Dungeons & Dragons hardcover core rulebook player's handbook, and realised for that money, you can purchase everything you need from Crooked Staff Publishing to play the game, except pencils and dice. It brings me a lot of joy to see improvements to what I created, and this cheap, fun, do-it-yourself hobby branch of the role-playing and wargaming scene still going strong many years later. I originally set out to make tabletop gaming accessories that were simple, did exactly what they needed to do, would last a lifetime, and would be safe for the environment, plus fun to make and use with their family and friends of all ages. So I reached out to Kris Richards of Crooked Staff Publishing and asked him 10 questions. Here's that interview, and please do check out his stuff. It's really quite good and a lot of fun to make and play around with. Oh, and my mission to make the best gaming accessories in the world has not stopped. Very soon I'll be launching my second Kickstarter campaign for the second generation silicone battle mats, the nigh indestructible, environmentally friendly, super versatile, last a lifetime gaming surface that I'm extremely proud of and stake my reputation on without hesitation. So, Kris, when did you start making this stuff and why?
I think I've just always been doing this kind of stuff, really. Back when I was a kid, I was always obsessed with the maps and the dungeons part of the games, usually drawing things out in felt tip pens and then piecing sheets of paper together to make large dungeons or villages or, whatever. Then later, when I had an Amiga and an old dot matrix printer, I did a few basic things that I suppose I'm similar to what I'm doing now, to be honest. Like I'd draw a door image in Deluxe Paint. If you're not familiar with that, it's like Windows Paint, I suppose, and I'd make those into little standees and stuff like that. Later on, I'd discover Hearst Arts molds, and that's when I think I made my first ever 2.5D dungeon. That's long before anyone had ever coined the phrase, I suppose. It was just a dungeon with low walls, but I think I ended up giving that one away. Anyway, several years later, I think that's when I discovered channels like the DM's Craft and the DMG Info, and I thought, that looks pretty cool. But the Hearst Art stuff, that had taught me that I really didn't like painting terrain, not at all. So when I saw your video using some of the Heroic Map stuff, that was kind of a light bulb moment, I suppose, because I'd already got some 2D dungeon tiles of my own, so I just thought that, why not make all of the artwork as individual textures, like the stone floor on one sheet of paper, the wall pattern on another, a separate sheet for pillars, barrels, crates, and so on, so that it's a kind of a mix of regular crafting and paper crafts. It's still building the terrain, but everything is covered in a paper facade. And I've probably described that badly, but I think I started doing that in around 2014, I think, just posting pictures on my blog to a very small audience, and maybe on DM Scotty's forum, I think it was. But 3 or 4 years later, I was brave enough to give YouTube a try, and I've been there ever since. It really is something that I should have done sooner.
What sort of help or resources did you find to learn from when you started selling these products and making videos about them?
I'm not sure really, as I'm the kind of person that just likes to tinker with stuff and to figure things out for myself. So everything that I've learned has probably taken twice as long to figure out than it should have done, but it's just been a lot of repeated trial and error, I suppose. Probably not the best way to go about things, but yeah, I think I'm just stubborn.
You have a nice community of crafters around you. How much do interaction and feedback from your fans and customers play a part in your design process, and what has changed due mainly to their input?
Yeah, as I say, I should have done this YouTube thing a lot sooner, as the vast majority of people, they've been great so far, and I'd like to think I've made some good friends as well. But to get back to the question, people are always making suggestions or posting pictures of some of their own creations, and that does sometimes send me off in unexpected directions. I mean, I have done some things that are pretty much just straight up requests, but it's usually something that I think I can use myself at some point. I suppose I am a little bit selfish in that sense, as I am making most of this stuff for my own games, so maybe not straight away, but there's usually a couple of encounter ideas behind them. So right now, for example, I have very little interest in running a modern superhero game. It's just not my thing, so even if I was to get like a ton of requests, I'm unlikely to go that route, as my heart just wouldn't be in it, and I think people can tell when that's the case. Dungeons, on the other hand, all these years later, I'm still not tired of dungeons. But yeah, some people have made suggestions for trying out different types of materials and things like that, like using the label paper, for example, or making door frames with interchangeable doors. So ideas can come from anywhere, really.
Do you have plans to expand the Tiny Terrain line of products further into things like swamps, castles, spaceports, modern cities, jungles, alien planets, volcanic or dungeon themes?
Well, the Tiny Terrain's a bit of a strange one, really, as it was only really meant to be a way of kind of throwing little village maps together, on the fly. So if the party have headed off somewhere new that you've not really prepared for, you could just throw down a few of these village hexes on the table, and there's a little tiny 3D representation of the village of, Old Haven or whatever, which you've just kind of pulled out of thin air. But to answer the question, the next Tiny Terrain PDF will either be, I think, a shoreline set with things like docks, piers, little medieval ships, so cogs, caravels, that kind of thing. It would be that, or some kind of stone building texture instead. For making things like towers, walls, temples, castles, that kind of thing. Maybe some city streets as well. So that's the current plan. No idea when I'll eventually get around to it, but yeah, that's the plan.
If you could partner up with another creator or crafter with a different skill set from you, what sort of dream team would you wish for?
I think I'm going to be a bit non-committal again, sorry, and say that I'm just really not sure. I mean, I kind of like the idea, but at the end of the day, I think I'm just happiest when I'm pottering along on my own, at my own pace. No one's really relying on me or needs me to work to a deadline or anything like that, so if I do mess up or have to step away for a while, then the only person I'll be letting down is myself. I'll not be dragging anyone else down with me. But, never say never. I just don't really know how that would work or what that would look like, but if something comes up and it sounds interesting and it seems like something I could do, then I'd probably give it a go.
How do you handle storage and transport of the relatively delicate terrain?
Badly is the honest answer. Things like the dungeon tiles, you can just throw those into a shoebox and not really have to worry about them much, but most of the little bits of scatter terrain, I'll keep them in some of those cheap little compartmentalised storage box things. You can get those over here for around £1 each, and I've probably got like 8 or 9 of them. I don't know, maybe a dozen. But in the past, when I've played at a club or at a game store, I'll still use a wet erase mat for a lot of things, and I'll just take enough terrain with me to lay out 1 or 2 set pieces, or maybe enough for a particular dungeon area. So at the end of the day, that might only be 1 shoebox full of tiles, and maybe 1 or 2 of those little toolbox things with things like barrels, crates, chests, all that kind of stuff crammed inside.
What do you offer your Patreon supporters?
Not a great deal, to be fair, and I do feel a bit guilty about that sometimes. I do sometimes get access to some work in progress textures, or occasionally get to vote on what I might do next. I sometimes run a few drop-in games over on Roll20 and they get first refusal. I'm not saying that's anything to shout about though, to be honest. It's not like I'm a fantastic GM or anything like that, but I just don't really want to keep any of the finished stuff behind a paywall. I mean, all of the print and pay stuff, it's pay what you want over on DriveThruRPG, so it's essentially free if you put a 0 in the little box. And I know people do keep telling me that's a terrible business model, but I don't know. I like to think that if I was 13 again, and it was 13-year-old me finding this stuff for the first time, this might sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I just think that younger me, he would have loved some of this stuff. Not that I'm kind of bashing any of the more expensive stuff out there. I'm just sure that he would have downloaded all of this stuff for free and saved his pocket money for more books and miniatures. Does that make sense at all? Probably not. But anyway, as far as Patreon and YouTube memberships go, there are a few perks, but it's more of a tips jar really, rather than getting your hands on lots of exclusive content. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it does help me out a lot. I just don't want people to feel obliged to join anything or feel that they're missing out. And I know that's not how today's world works, but, whatever. That's what I like to do.
Would you consider terrain crafting mainly as a way to make accessories for tabletop role-playing and wargaming, or is it mainly a hobby in and of itself with a happy practical use for TTRPGs and wargames?
To me, it's a bit of everything really. I'm a bit weird in the sense that most of the time I probably enjoy all of the prep just as much as the game itself, whether that's designing and making terrain and handouts, painting miniatures, drawing maps, writing encounters and so on, though as far as the terrain goes, I do make sure that most of the stuff, I mean not the tiny terrain, I'm talking about the stuff that's intended for use with miniatures, I like to make sure that it's playable, that's like its main purpose. At the end of the day, I am making it to get used at the table. They're not display pieces, so if that means I have to sacrifice a bit of realism now and again, which, let's be honest, usually makes things look a bit worse, then I'm not too worried about that. As I say, the idea is actually to play on them at some point.
What sort of printer have you got? What sort of gear do you use for making your videos?
I just use a cheap inkjet printer. I actually bought one of the cheapest ones I could find, just to kind of show that you really don't need anything special to make this kind of stuff. So, for the most part, it's cheap paper in a cheap printer. I use cheap glue sticks. I used to use a cheap glue gun, but that did blow up. But on the whole, I'm nothing if not cheap. Though, I suppose I do sometimes branch out and use things like sticky back paper, or I might actually buy some nice card or paper once in a while, but that's not my usual style. And as far as gear goes, again, I have a cheap camcorder that I'm using. I think it was like about 200 quid a few years back, though because of things like Patreon, that does allow me to get the full Adobe suite now, so I finally have an up-to-date version of Photoshop and Premiere Pro and so on, so I don't have to rely on outdated software anymore, which is really nice.
When you take your game night kit to friends' houses or to run some games, what's your essential mix of terrain, and do you think it limits your willingness to improvise and sandbox your games a bit due to bias toward using the terrain you brought with you?
I'm not sure that I have a basic kit or anything like that. I just try to kind of tailor it to fit whatever has a good chance of happening in the next session, if that makes sense. I can normally do that reasonably well just by asking the players at the end of the last session where they're going or what they think they'll be doing next, and also because I've kind of historically been the one-shot guy or the mini-campaign guy for some of the groups that I've played in. Just filling in between campaigns or when someone's missing but everyone else still wants to play something, which happens more often than you'd think. And those type of games, they're just a lot easier to prepare for. But if you really wanted to push me for an answer, then if you're running a dungeon, then maybe a couple of pillars, some barrels, crates, that kind of thing. Doors are not a bad thing to have. That's arguably one of the most important features of the room. And maybe a few tables or a tomb or something like that. Thinking about it, that might be a good topic for a future video, so I could maybe put something like that together. Though, on the subject of it being, a little bit limiting, I will say that just because someone's made some terrain, it doesn't mean that they always have to use it. I mean, admittedly, I do sometimes use it as a bit of a crutch. So if I'm planning a bar fight, for example, I'll try to make sure I've got something suitable to use. But if I didn't plan one, and one breaks out anyway, and if I think I'll need a map for it, then I'll just break out the Wet Erase battle mat, add a few bits of relevant scatter terrain, if I've got them, and that's usually more than good enough. And if I brought something with me that doesn't end up getting used, then it's not really an issue. But yeah, I do think that's one of the main pitfalls to watch out for, though. You know, the feeling that just because you've started making terrain, that you need to make all of the things all at once, and that you need to use it all the time. And that's not really the case. Not in my opinion, anyway. It's like everything else at the end of the day. It's just another tool in the toolbox.
Hey, thanks a lot, Kris. It's really been fun talking to you, man, and I really love your stuff. Check it out, everyone, and thanks for listening. I'll be back with more for you, as always, very soon.